Welcome to Part 4 of Murder on Broadway. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 16. Significant Disclosures. Thursday, June 13, forenoon. To Curry's surprise, Quentin requested to be awakened at 9 o'clock the following morning. By 10, we were enjoying breakfast on his tiny rooftop garden, basking in the warm June sunshine. "Van," he said to me, as Curry brought our second cups of coffee, "no matter how secretive a woman might be, there's always someone to whom she can share her thoughts. A confidant is vital to a woman's nature. It might be her mother, a lover, a priest, a doctor, or more commonly, a close friend. In the Cardinal's case, she has no mother or priest. Her lover, the charming Porter, was a potential adversary, and we can safely eliminate her doctor. She was too clever to confide in a man like Jensen. So the friend remains. Today we shall seek her out." He lit a cigarette and stood up. "But first, we need to visit Mr. Benjamin Brown on 7th Avenue. Benjamin Brown was a renowned photographer for stage stars, with a studio right in the heart of the city's theater district. As we stepped into the reception area of his lavish studio later that morning, my curiosity about the purpose of our visit was reaching its peak. Quentin approached the desk, where a young woman with striking red hair and dramatically made-up eyes was seated, and bowed with an air of formality. Then, pulling a small, unframed photograph from his pocket, he placed it in front of her. "I am producing a musical comedy, mademoiselle," he said, "and I need to contact the young lady who left this picture with me. Unfortunately, I've misplaced her card, but since her photograph has Brown's imprint, I thought you could kindly check your records and tell me who she is and how I might reach her." He discreetly slid a $5 bill under the edge of the blotter and waited with an expression of naive anticipation. The young woman regarded him with an amused look, and I thought I caught the hint of a smile at the corners of her expertly painted lips. After a moment, she picked up the photograph without saying a word and slipped out through a back door. 10 minutes later, she came back and handed Quentin the picture. On the back, she had written a name and address. "The young lady is Miss Alice LaFarce, and she resides at the Balafield Hotel." There was no mistaking her smile now. "You really ought to be more careful with the addresses of your applicants. Some poor girl could miss out on an engagement." Her smile quickly transformed into gentle laughter. "Mademoiselle," Quentin replied, feigning seriousness, "from now on I'll heed your advice." He nodded in a mock bow before stepping outside. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed as we stepped onto 7th Avenue. "Honestly, I should have disguised myself as an impresario, complete with a gold-headed cane, a bowler hat, and a flashy shirt. That young woman is utterly convinced I'm plotting something devious. A charming little coquette, indeed." He turned into the florist's shop at the corner and selected a dozen American beauties, addressing them to Benjamin Brown's receptionist. "And now," he said, "let's take a stroll to the Balafield and try to arrange a meeting with Alice." As we walked across town, Quentin explained, "That first morning, when we were examining the Cardinal's rooms, it struck me that the murder wouldn't be solved by typical heavy-handed police tactics. It was a cleverly orchestrated crime, despite its obvious nature. No ordinary investigation would do. We needed detailed information. So when I spotted that photograph of the blonde Alice partially buried under a pile of papers on the desk, I thought, a friend of the late Eleanor. She might know just the things we need." When the sergeant's back was turned, I discreetly tucked the picture into my pocket. It was the only photo in the room, and it bore the usual sentimental note, "Ever thine," signed Alice. I deduced that Alice must have been the Cardinal's muse. Naturally, I removed the inscription before showing the picture to the perceptive woman at Brown. And here we are at the Balafield, hoping for a bit of enlightenment. The Balafield was a small, upscale apartment hotel in the East 30s, and judging by the guests filling the American-style Queen Anne lobby, it catered to the affluent social crowd. Quentin sent his card up to Miss LaFarce and received a reply that she would see him in a few minutes. Those few minutes stretched into nearly 3/4 of an hour, and it was almost noon when a flamboyant bellboy arrived to escort us to the ladies' apartment. Nature had blessed Miss Lafarce with many charms, and where it fell short, she had filled in the gaps herself. She was slender and blonde, her large blue eyes adorned with thick lashes. Despite the wide-eyed look she gave, there was an undeniable sophistication in her gaze. Her appearance had been crafted with meticulous care. As I watched her, I couldn't help but think how perfect she would have been as a model for Sherritt's pastel posters. "So you must be Mr. Quentin," she purred. "I've seen your name in town topics quite a bit." Quentin flinched slightly. "And this is Mr. Van Dyne," he said with a charming smile. "Just an attorney who, until now, hasn't been graced by the pages of that fashionable magazine." "Please have a seat," she said, delivering the line with an air of theatrical flair that suggested she'd rehearsed it. "I really don't know why I should be receiving you. I suppose it's for business. Perhaps you want me to appear at some society bazaar or something of that sort. But I'm so busy, Mr. Quentin, you can't possibly imagine how occupied I am with my work. I just love my work," she added, letting out a dreamy sigh. "And I'm sure there are countless others who adore it as well," Quentin replied, exuding his best drawing-room charm. "But, unfortunately, I haven't come to discuss any bazaar where your delightful presence might be needed. I have a much more serious matter to discuss." "You were quite close with Miss Eleanor Simon." At the mention of the Cardinal's name, Miss Lafarce sprang to her feet. The false air of sophistication she had been trying to project vanished in an instant. Her eyes flashed as they narrowed dangerously, and a sneer twisted her delicate mouth. She tossed her head defiantly. "Hey, who do you think you are? I don't know anything, and I've got nothing to say. So why don't you just leave, along with your lawyer?" But Quentin didn't budge. Instead, he pulled out his cigarette case and selected a Ragey with care. "Mind if I smoke? Would you like one? I import these directly from my contact in Constantinople. They're perfectly blended." She scoffed at him, her expression icy. The girl who had once seemed charming now appeared fierce. "Get out of my apartment, or I'll call the house detective." She turned to the telephone mounted on the wall beside her. Quentin waited patiently until she lifted the receiver. "If you do that, Miss Lafarce, I'll make sure you're taken to the district attorney's office for questioning," he said nonchalantly as he lit his cigarette and leaned back comfortably in his chair. Slowly, she set the receiver back down and faced him. "What's your game, anyway? What if I did know Margie? Then what? Where do you fit in?" "Ah, lass, I don't fit in at all," Quentin replied with a pleasant smile. "But frankly, nobody seems to fit in. The reality is, they're about to pin the murder of your friend on some poor sap who wasn't part of the scene either. I happen to know the district attorney quite well, and I'm aware of exactly what's happening. The police are racing around in a complete frenzy, and it's hard to tell what leads they'll chase next. I thought, that I might spare you some trouble with a friendly little chat." "Of course," he added, "if you'd rather I pass your name along to the police, I can do that and let them handle things their usual, rather clumsy way. I should mention that, for the moment, they have no idea about your connection with Miss Simon, and if you act sensibly, I see no reason for them to find out." The girl stood with one hand on the telephone, studying Quentin closely. He had spoken casually, with a friendly tone, and finally she sat back down. "Now, why not have one of my cigarettes?" he asked, his voice warm and conciliatory. She took one without thinking, keeping her eyes on him as if trying to gauge his trustworthiness. "Who are they planning to arrest?" she asked the question, her expression barely changing. "A guy named Porter. Pretty ridiculous, don't you think?" "Him?" Her voice dripped with contempt and disgust. "That pathetic crook. He doesn't have the guts to strangle a cat." "Exactly. But that doesn't mean he deserves the electric chair, right?" Quentin leaned in, smiling in a friendly way. "Miss Lafarce, if you could talk to me for just 5 minutes and forget that we're strangers, I promise not to tell the police or the district attorney anything about you. I'm not part of the authorities, but I really don't like the thought of the wrong person being punished. I swear I'll keep the source of any information you share with me to myself. If you can trust me, It'll make things a lot easier for you in the long run." The girl was silent for several moments. I could tell she was weighing her options with Quentin, and it seemed she decided that, given her friendship with the Cardinal was already exposed, she had nothing to lose by speaking with this man who promised to shield her from further trouble. "I guess you're not so bad," she said, still uncertain. "But I don't know why I should feel that way." She paused. "But listen, I was told to stay out of this. If I don't, I might end up back in the chorus line again. That's no life for a sweet young thing like me with such fancy tastes. Trust me on that, my friend." "That disaster won't happen to you as long as I'm careful," Quentin replied, earnest yet light-hearted. "Who told you to stay out of it?" "My fiancé," she replied playfully. "He's quite prominent, and he worries that there could be a scandal if I ended up involved in the case as a witness or anything like that." "I can understand his concerns," Quentin said, nodding with understanding. "And who, if you don't mind my curiosity, is this fortunate gentleman?" "Hey, you're flattering," she said, giving him a teasing smile. "But I'm not ready to announce my engagement just yet." "Don't be cruel," Quentin pleaded. "You know perfectly well that I could find out his name if I really wanted to. And if you push me to dig up the details elsewhere, then my promise to keep your name confidential wouldn't hold." Miss Lafarce paused to think about this. "I suppose you could uncover it easily enough, so I might as well tell you, but I'm counting on your word to keep me safe." She widened her eyes and gave Quentin a sincere look. "I know you wouldn't let me down." "My dear Miss Lafarce," he gasped in mock disbelief. "Well, my fiancé is Mr. Julian, and he runs a major fur-importing business. You see," she leaned in closer, confiding in him, "Lowy, that is, Mr. Julian, used to date Margie. That's why he was so keen for me to stay out of it. He said the police might come asking him questions, and he didn't want his name in the papers. It could damage his business reputation." "I completely understand," Quentin replied thoughtfully. "Do you happen to know where Mr. Julian was on Monday night?" The girl looked taken aback. "Of course I know. He was right here with me from 10:30 until 2 in the morning. We were talking about a new musical he was excited about, and he wanted me to take the lead role." "I'm sure it's going to be a hit," Quentin said with an easy charm. "Did you spend Monday evening alone?" "Not at all." The thought seemed to amuse her. "I went to the Scandals, but got home early. I knew Lowy, Mr. Julian, was coming by." "I hope he appreciated your sacrifice." Quentin seemed a bit let down by this unexpected excuse involving Julian. It was so definitive that pressing further felt pointless. After a brief pause, he shifted the conversation. "So, what do you know about a Mr. Charles Brady? He was a friend of Miss Simon." "Oh, Pop's a decent guy." The girl clearly felt relieved by this change of topic. "A good fellow. He was definitely smitten with Margie. Even after she ditched him for Mr. Trafford, he remained loyal, always chasing after her, sending her flowers and gifts. Some men are like that. Poor old Pop. He even called me Monday night to have me reach out to Margie and try to set up a party. Maybe if I had, she wouldn't be dead now. It's a strange world, isn't it?" "Oh, it's endlessly strange." Quentin smoked quietly for a moment, and I couldn't help but admire his composure. "What time did Mr. Brady call you Monday night? Do you remember?" His tone suggested the question wasn't particularly significant. "Let me think." She pursed her lips thoughtfully. "It was about 10 minutes to midnight. I remember because the little chime clock on the mantel was striking 12, and at first I couldn't hear Pop very well. I always set my clock 10 minutes fast, so I'm never late for anything." Quentin checked his watch against the clock. "Yes, it's 10 minutes fast. And what about the party?" "Oh, I was too caught up talking about the new show, so I had to decline. Besides, Mr. Julian didn't want to have a party that night." "It wasn't my fault, right?" "Not at all," Quentin said, reassuring her. "Work comes first, especially work as vital as yours. Now, there's one last person I want to ask you about, and then I'll leave you alone. What was the deal between Miss Simon and Dr. Jensen?" Miss Lafarce looked genuinely concerned. I was afraid you'd bring him up. Anxiety flickered in her eyes. I'm not quite sure how to explain. He was head over heels for Margie, and she didn't discourage him. But she ended up regretting it because he got jealous, like unreasonably so. He would hassle her constantly, and once, can you believe it, he threatened to shoot her and then take his own life. I warned Margie to be careful around him, but she didn't seem scared. Still, I think she was taking a huge risk. Oh. Do you think it could have been? Do you really think? Wasn't there anyone else, Quentin interjected, who might have felt similarly? Anyone Miss Simon might have had reason to fear? No, Miss Lafarce shook her head. Margie didn't spend time with many men. She didn't go out often, if you catch my drift. Besides the ones you've mentioned, there was only Mr. Trafford. He waited for his chance, several months ago. She went to dinner with him Monday night, too. That's how I found out. I wanted her to join me at the scandals. Quentin stood and extended his hand. You've been incredibly helpful, and you have nothing to worry about. No one will ever know about our little chat this morning. Who do you think killed Margie? The girl's voice trembled with genuine emotion. Lowie thinks it was probably a burglar after her jewels. I'm too wise to stir trouble in this happy household by challenging Mr. Julian's views, Quentin said, with a hint of teasing. No one knows who's guilty, but the police are aligned with Mr. Julian's thoughts. For a moment, doubt crossed the girl's face, and she looked at Quentin intently. Why are you so interested? You didn't know Margie, did you? She never mentioned you. Quentin chuckled. My dear, I can't quite explain why I'm so deeply invested in this situation. Honestly, I can't even give you a flimsy reason. No, I've never met Miss Simon. But it would truly bother me if Mr. Porter took the fall while the real culprit got away scot-free. Perhaps I'm just being sentimental. Quite the sad state of affairs, isn't it? I suppose I'm getting soft, too, she nodded, maintaining eye contact with Quentin. I risked my comfortable life to tell you what I did because I believed you. Tell me, you weren't just playing me for a fool, were you? Quentin placed a hand over his heart and grew serious. My dear Miss Lafarce, when I leave this place, it will be as if I had never come at all. Do forget about me and Mr. Van Dyne. Something in his demeanor eased her worries, and she wished us a playful goodbye. Chapter 17. Checking an alibi. Thursday, June 13, afternoon. My sleuthing has gone quite well, Quentin exclaimed as we stepped back into the street. Fair Alice was a true treasure trove of information, wasn't she? Still, you really ought to have kept your composure when she mentioned her beloved's name. Honestly, Van, it was quite the display. I noticed you flinch and heard you let out quite the sigh. Such displays of emotion do not suit a lawyer. He made a phone call to Stanford from a booth in a nearby drugstore. I'm treating you to lunch. There are many confidences I wish to share. After some back and forth, Quentin emerged victorious. Moments later, a taxi was whisking us downtown. Alice is clever. There's real intelligence beneath that fluffy exterior, he mused. She's brighter than Oscar. She immediately realized that Porter wasn't guilty. Her description of the immaculate Tony was crass but dead on, oh, so accurate. And you noticed how she had faith in me. Touching, wasn't it? This is a tricky situation, Van. Something feels off. He fell silent, smoking thoughtfully for several blocks. Julian, strange that he should reappear. He told Alice to keep quiet. But why? Perhaps his reasoning was the truth. Who can say? On the other hand, was he with his beloved from 10:30 until the early morning? Well, who knows? There's something fishy about that business deal. And then there's Brady. He called just 10 minutes before midnight. Oh yes, that part is true. But how could he have made that call from a moving car? He couldn't. Maybe he actually wanted to have a chat with his wayward Cardinal, you know. But then what's with the flimsy alibi? Cowardice, perhaps. But why the roundabout? Why not reach out to his lost love directly? Ah, maybe he did. Someone certainly called her at 20 minutes to 12. We need to investigate that, Van. Yes, he might have called her, and then when a man answered, who was that man anyway? He may have turned to Alice for help. Quite natural, you know. Regardless, he wasn't in Boonton. Poor Stanford. He'll be so distressed when he discovers this. What really troubles me is that story about the doctor. Jealous mania. It fits Ambroise's character to a T. He's just the kind of man who could easily lose his grip. I suspected that his confession of paternalism was just a smokescreen. Can you believe it? The doctor was making threats and waving around pistols, huh? That's bad news. I don't like it. With his ears sticking out like that, he wouldn't think twice about pulling the trigger. It's paranoia, that's what it is. Delusions of persecution. He probably thought the girl and Pop, or maybe the girl and Trafford, were conspiring against him and laughing behind his back. You can't trust guys like that. They're cunning and dangerous. The sharp alleys had him figured out. She warned the Cardinal about him. Overall, it's a wicked mess. Still, I feel somewhat optimistic. We're making progress. Oh, there's no doubt about it, though I can't even guess where we're headed. It's dreadfully irritating. Stanford was waiting for us at the Bankers' Club. He greeted Quentin with irritation. What do you have to tell me that's so damned urgent? Now, don't be testy. Quentin was all smiles. How's your guiding star, Porter, behaving? So far, he's done everything virtuous and proper, except join the Christian Endeavor Society. Sunday's coming. Give him a little time, so you're not feeling happy, dear Stanford. Was I dragged away from another appointment to report on my mood? Not needed. Your mood is abysmal. Cheer up. I've brought you something to ponder. Damn it, I have too much to think about already. Here, have some brioche. Quentin ordered lunch without consulting either of us. Now, here come my revelations. First off, Pop Brady wasn't in Boonton last Monday night. He was very much in the heart of our modern Gomorrah, trying to set up a midnight party. Wonderful, Stanford scoffed. I revel in your wisdom. I take it his alter ego was traveling to Hopatcong. The supernatural doesn't impress me. You can be as skeptical as you like. Brady was in New York at midnight on Monday, seeking excitement. And what about the speeding ticket? That's for you to explain. But if you value my advice, you should call for that Boonton officer and let him take a look at Pop. If he confirms that Brady is the man he marked, I'll gladly take my leave from this world. Well, that definitely makes it worth pursuing. I'll have the officer at the Beaumont Club this afternoon, and I'll point Brady out to him. What other jaw-dropping revelations do you have for us? Julian is worth investigating. Stanford set down his knife and fork, leaning back in his chair. I'm astounded. Such monumental insight. With that evidence against him, he ought to be arrested on the spot. Quentin, my dear old friend, are you feeling all right? No dizzy spells lately. No sharp pains in your head. Your knees behaving. Moreover, Dr. Jensen was head over heels for the Cardinal and incredibly jealous. He recently threatened to grab a pistol and hold his own little massacre. That's more like it. Stanford sat up straight. Where did you learn this? Ah, that's my little secret. Stanford frowned. Why the secrecy? Necessity, my dear fellow. I gave my word and all that. I can be a bit old-fashioned, you know, too many tales of chivalry in my youth. He said it lightly, but Stanford knew him well enough not to press the matter. Less than 5 minutes after we returned to the district attorney's office, Oscar walked in. I've got more on Julian, sir. Thought you might want to add it to the report I submitted yesterday. Burke got a photo of him and showed it to the phone operators at Simon's house. They both recognized him. He's been there several times, but it wasn't the Cardinal he went to see. The woman in apartment 2 is named Frisbee. She used to be one of Julian's fur models. He's visited her a few times in the last 6 months and taken her out once or twice, but he hasn't called on her in over a month. Is that useful? Can't say just yet. Stanford shot Quentin a curious glance. But thanks for the tip, Sergeant. By the way, Quentin said sweetly after Oscar had left, I'm feeling quite splendid. No headaches, no dizzy spells. My reflexes are perfect. Glad to hear it. Still, I can't accuse a man of murder just because he has a furry model. You're being too quick to judge. Why would you accuse him of murder? Quentin stood up and stretched. Come on, Van. I'd really like to check out Perneb's tomb at the Metropolitan this afternoon. Do you think you can handle it? He paused at the door. By the way, Stanford, what about the Boonton bailiff? Stanford rang for Donovan. "I'll take care of it right away. Swing by the club around 5 if you're up for it. I'll have the officer here then, since Brady is sure to drop in before dinner." When Quentin and I arrived back at the club later that afternoon, Stanford was positioned in the lounge, facing the main entrance of the rotunda. Beside him sat a tall, solidly built man in his 40s, tanned and alert, but clearly uneasy. "Traffic Officer Phipps just came in from Boonton," Stanford introduced. "Brady is expected any minute now. He has an appointment here at 5:30. Quentin pulled up a chair. "I really hope he's on time." "Me too," Stanford replied sharply. "I'm looking forward to your dramatic exit." "Our fortune is loss. Our hope is merely sad despair," Quentin murmured. Less than 10 minutes later, Brady walked into the rotunda from the street, stopped at the front desk, and strolled into the lounge. It was impossible to miss the observation point Stanford had chosen, and as Brady passed by us, he paused to exchange pleasantries. Stanford held him up for a moment with a few casual questions before Brady moved on. "Is that the guy you ticketed, officer?" Stanford asked, turning to Phipps, who was frowning in confusion. "He looks a bit like him, sir. There's a resemblance, but it's not him." Phipps shook his head firmly. "No, sir, that's not the man. The guy I issued a summons to was bulkier than this one and not as tall." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely, sir. No mistake about it. The guy I tagged tried to argue with me first, and then he offered me a 50 to forget the whole thing." I had my headlights focused on him completely. Phipps received a generous tip. "Vi misero mihi," sighed Quentin. "My miserable existence continues. How unfortunate, but you must find a way to endure it. Say, Stanford, what does Pop Brady's brother look like?" "That's right," Stanford nodded. "I've met his brother. He's shorter and heavier. This situation is getting out of hand. I think I'll confront Brady now." He started to get up, but Quentin pushed him back into his seat. "Don't be rash. Practice some patience. Brady isn't going anywhere. There are still a couple of preliminary steps we should take first. Julian and Jensen are still piquing my curiosity." Stanford stood firm on his stance. "Julian and Jensen aren't here right now, but Brady is. I want to know why he lied to me about that summons." "I can explain that," said Quentin. "He wanted you to think he was out in the New Jersey wilderness at midnight on Monday. Quite straightforward, isn't it?" "That deduction speaks well of your intelligence, but I hope you don't genuinely believe Brady is guilty. He might know something, but I can't picture him as a murderer." "And why is that?" "He doesn't fit the profile. It's unimaginable, even if evidence pointed in his direction." "Ah, the psychological perspective. You dismiss Brady because you believe his character doesn't align with the situation. But doesn't that come dangerously close to being a subjective theory or a metaphysical leap? Still, I don't entirely agree with your assessment of Brady. That sharp-eyed gambler has hidden depths of malevolence, but I completely support the theory itself. And look, my dear Stanford, you apply psychology in its most basic sense, yet mark my use of it in its more complex forms. Consistency may be a trait of small minds, but it remains a valuable quality. Care for a cup of tea?" We made our way to the Palm Room and settled at a table by the entrance. Quentin ordered oolong tea, while Stanford and I opted for black coffee. A skilled 4-piece orchestra was performing Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite while we sat comfortably in our chairs, lost in silence. Stanford seemed weary and downcast, while Quentin was consumed by the puzzle that had occupied his mind since Tuesday morning. I had never seen him so distracted. We had been there for about half an hour when Trafford walked in. He paused to greet us, and Stanford invited him to join us. Trafford also looked troubled. His eyes revealed a sense of unease. "I can hardly bear to ask you this, Mr. Stanford," he said hesitantly after ordering a ginger ale, "but what are my chances now of being called as a witness?" "Unfortunately, they haven't improved since I last saw you," Stanford replied. "In fact, nothing has happened to change the situation at all." "And what about the man you suspected?" "He's still a suspect, but no arrests have been made. We're hoping something will happen soon. I assume you still need me to stay in the city. If you can manage it, yes. Trafford fell silent for a moment, then spoke again. I don't want to seem like I'm avoiding responsibility, and I know this may come off as selfish, but isn't the phone operator's testimony about the time of Miss Simon's return and her calls for help enough to establish the facts without my support? I've considered that, of course. If we can prepare the case for the prosecution without needing you to testify, I assure you we will. As of now, I see no reason for you to be called as a witness, but one never knows what may arise. If the defense hinges on the precise timing and there's any challenge to the operator's testimony, you might still be needed. Otherwise, you won't. Trafford took a sip of his ginger ale, and a bit of his gloom seemed to lift. You're being very kind, Mr. Stanford. I wish there were a proper way to thank you. He glanced up nervously. I suppose you still don't want me to visit the apartment. I know you think I'm being unreasonable, maybe even sentimental, but the girl meant something to me that's hard to let go of. I don't expect you to fully grasp it. I hardly do myself. I think it's quite understandable, you know, Quentin remarked, with a compassion I had rarely seen from him. Your feelings don't need an apology. History and stories are filled with similar situations, and the characters have always shared feelings like yours. Your most notable example is, of course, Odysseus on that fragrant Isle of Argija with the enchanting Calypso. The gentle arms of sirens have been wrapping around men's necks since the red-haired Lilith worked her devastating charms on the impressionable Adam. We're all descendants of that lively fellow. Trafford smiled. At least you provide me with a historical context, he said. He then turned to Stanford. What will happen to Miss Simon's belongings, her furniture and such? Sergeant Oscar heard from her aunt in Seattle, Stanford replied. She's on her way to New York, I believe, to handle what's left of the estate. And everything will remain as it is until then. Most likely longer, unless something unexpected comes up. Anyway, it'll stay intact until that time. There are a couple of small items I'd like to keep, Trafford admitted, a bit sheepishly, I thought. After a few more minutes of casual conversation, he stood up and, citing an engagement, wished us a good afternoon. I hope I can keep his name out of this case, Stanford said once Trafford had left. Yes, his situation isn't enviable, Quentin agreed. It's always tragic to be discovered. The moralists would call it retribution. In this case, fortune certainly favored the just. If he hadn't picked Monday night for the winter garden, he could be at home with his family, with nothing more burdensome to worry about than a guilty conscience. It certainly seems that way. Quentin checked his watch. Speaking of the winter garden, would you mind if we had dinner a bit earlier? I'm feeling drawn to some excitement tonight. I'm off to the Scandals. We both stared at him, as if he had lost his mind. Don't be so shocked, my dear Stanford. Why shouldn't I follow my whims? And by the way, I hope to bring you some good news by lunchtime tomorrow. Chapter 18. The Trap. Friday, June 14, noon. Quentin slept in the next day. I had gone with him to the Scandals the night before, utterly bewildered by his strange urge to seek out an entertainment he clearly despised. At noon, he called for his car and instructed the chauffeur to take us to the Balafield Hotel. We're about to pay another visit to the captivating alleys, he said. I'd bring flowers to honor her, but I worry dear Julian might pry into their significance. Miss Lafosse greeted us with an expression of bitter resentment. I should have expected this. She shook her head with a scornful understanding. I suppose you're here to tell me the cops found out about me without any help from you. Her disdain was nearly impressive. Did you bring them along? What a great friend you are. But honestly, it's my own fault for being such a fool. Quentin remained calm as she finished her biting monologue. Then he gave a polite bow. Actually, I just stopped by to pay my respects, and to let you know that the police have submitted their report on Miss Simon's acquaintances, and your name wasn't included. You appeared a bit anxious about that yesterday, so I thought I'd ease your mind. Her guarded demeanor softened. Is that true? Goodness, I can't imagine what would happen if Lowy found out I'd been talking. I assure you he won't find out unless you tell him. Will you be kind enough to invite me to sit down for a moment? Of course, I'm sorry. I'm just having my coffee. Please join me. She signaled for 2 more cups. Quentin had just finished 2 cups of coffee less than half an hour ago, and I was amazed by his enthusiasm for such terrible hotel brew. I finally caught the scandals last night, he said casually, leaning back in his chair. I missed it earlier this season. What made you wait so long to see it yourself? I've been swamped, she admitted. I was rehearsing for a pair of queens, but they've postponed it. Lowy couldn't secure the theater he wanted. Do you enjoy reviews? Quentin inquired. I would think they pose more challenges for the leads than regular musical comedies. They do, Miss Lafarce responded with a hint of authority, and they can be quite unsatisfying. The individual talent tends to get lost in the mix. There's no real opportunity to shine. They're just so frenetic, you know what I mean. I can see that, Quentin said, taking a brave sip of his coffee. But there were several numbers in the scandals that you would have performed beautifully. They seemed tailor-made for you. As I watched, I couldn't help but think of you doing them, and it honestly diminished my enjoyment of the lady who was on stage. You're too kind, Mr. Quentin, but I do have a decent voice. I've put in a lot of effort, and I trained with Professor Markov for my dancing. Really? I doubted Quentin had ever heard of him before, but his reaction suggested he considered Professor Markov one of the greatest ballet masters in the world. Then you absolutely should have been featured in the scandals. The young lady I'm thinking of sang quite poorly, and her dancing was subpar. Plus, she lacked your charm and appeal. Be honest, didn't you feel a little twinge of wanting to sing the Chinese lullaby song last Monday night? Oh, I'm not sure. Miss Lafarce thought carefully about his words. They kept the lights so dim, and cerise isn't my best color, but the costumes were lovely, weren't they? They definitely would have looked stunning on you. What color do you like best? I adore the shades of orchid, she replied with enthusiasm. Though I also look pretty good in turquoise blue. An artist once told me I should always wear white. He wanted to paint my portrait, but the gentleman I was engaged to at the time didn't care for him. Quentin studied her thoughtfully. I think your artist friend had a point. And you know, the St. Moritz scene in the scandals would have suited you perfectly. The little brunette who sang the snow song, all in white, was charming, but honestly, she should have had golden hair. Dark beauties belong in warmer places. She just didn't convey the sparkle and vitality you expect from a Swiss resort in midwinter. You could have brought those qualities beautifully. Yes, I would have preferred that over the Chinese number, I think. White fox is my favorite fur, too, but still, in a review, you're featured in one number and then gone in the next. When it's all over, you're forgotten. She sighed unhappily. Quentin set down his cup and looked at her with playful reproach. After a moment, he said, Why did you lie to me about what time Mr. Julian came to see you last Monday night? That wasn't very nice. What do you mean? Miss Lafarce exclaimed, her indignation rising as she straightened, assuming an air of superiority. Well, Quentin explained, the St. Moritz scene in the scandals doesn't start until nearly 11, and it's the last act. So it's impossible you could have seen it and also had Mr. Julian here at 10:30. Now, tell me, what time did he actually arrive on Monday night? The girl flushed with anger. You're quite clever, aren't you? You make a good detective. So what if I didn't get home until after the show? Is that a crime? Not at all, Quentin replied calmly. Just a bit of a breach of trust in telling me you got home early. He leaned forward earnestly. I'm not here to cause you trouble. On the contrary, I want to protect you from any distress. You see, if the police start poking around, they might run into you. But if I can provide the district attorney with accurate details about certain events from Monday night, there's no risk of the police coming to look for you. Miss Lafarce's expression hardened. Her brow creased with determination. Listen, I have nothing to hide, and nor does Lowie. But if Lowie asks me to say he was somewhere at 10:30, then that's what I'll say. Got it? To me, that's what friendship means. Lowie must have had a good reason to ask, or he wouldn't have done it. But since you think you're so clever and have accused me of being dishonest, let me tell you that he didn't arrive until after midnight. If anyone else asks me about it, I'd rather face the worst than tell them anything other than the 10:30 story. Do you understand? Quentin bowed slightly. I understand, and I admire you for it. But don't go thinking the wrong thing, she continued, her eyes shining with intensity. Lowie may not have gotten here until after midnight, but if you think he has any knowledge about Margie's death, you're mistaken. He was done with Margie a year ago. He barely even noticed she existed. And if any foolish officer gets the idea that Lowie was involved in this mess, I'll back him up, so help me God, even if it's the last thing I do. I'm starting to like you more and more, said Quentin, and when she offered her hand to say goodbye, he lifted it to his lips. As we made our way downtown, Quentin was lost in thought. We were almost to the criminal courts building before he spoke again. The straightforward Alice really interests me, he said. She deserves much better than the slick Julian. Women are incredibly perceptive, and yet so easily fooled. A woman can see through a man with almost magical clarity, but when it comes to her own partner, she's astonishingly blind. Just look at Alice's loyalty to Julian. He probably told her he was working late at the office on Monday night. Naturally, she doesn't believe it, but she knows, truly believes, that her Lowie couldn't have been involved in the Cardinal's death. Well, let's hope she's right, and that Julian isn't caught, at least not until a new show gets its funding. My goodness, if being a detective leads to many more reviews, I'll have to quit. Thank goodness, though, the lady didn't go to the cinema on Monday night. When we arrived at the district attorney's office, we found Oscar and Stanford deep in discussion. Stanford had a pad in front of him, pages filled with neatly organized notes and annotations. A cloud of cigar smoke surrounded him. Oscar was across from him, elbows resting on the table, chin cupped in his hands. He looked ready to fight, but also defeated. I'm going over the case with the sergeant, Stanford said, glancing at us briefly. We're trying to sort out all the key points to see if there's anything we've missed. I told the sergeant about the doctor's obsession and his threats, along with traffic officer Phipp's inability to identify Brady. But the more we uncover, the messier it gets, apparently. He gathered the sheets and clipped them together. The truth is, we don't have solid evidence against anyone. There are suspicious circumstances tied to Porter, Dr. Jensen, and Brady, and our talk with Julian didn't exactly clear suspicions in his direction, either. But when we really look at the facts, we've got some fingerprints from Porter that might have been made late Monday afternoon. Dr. Jensen loses his mind when we ask him where he was Monday night, then gives us a flimsy alibi. He shows a fatherly concern for the girl, but the truth is he's really in love with her, a perfectly normal little deceit. Brady lent his car to his brother and lied about it, so I'd believe he was in Boonton Monday at midnight. And Julian gives us a series of evasive answers about his relationship with the girl. Not exactly a wealth of information. I wouldn't say your details were completely lacking, Quentin remarked, pulling up a chair next to the sergeant. They could be incredibly useful if we could just piece them together correctly. The trouble, it seems, is that some pieces of the puzzle are missing. Find them, and I bet everything will fit together nicely, like a mosaic. It's easy to say, find them, Stanford grumbled. The real issue is knowing where to look. Oscar relit his extinguished cigar and waved his hand impatiently. We can't ignore Porter. He's the one who did it, and if it weren't for Abe Rubin, I'd get the truth out of him. By the way, Mr. Quentin, he definitely had his own key to the Simon apartment. He glanced at Stanford uncertainly. I don't want to come off as critical, sir, but I feel like we're wasting time going after Simon's acquaintances, Brady, Julian, and this doctor. You may have a point there. Stanford seemed to be considering it, but I still want to know why Jensen acted the way he did. Well, that could help us, Oscar conceded. If the doctor was so obsessed with Simon that he threatened to shoot her, and then he lost his cool when you asked him for an alibi. He might have something to tell us. Why not give him a little scare? His background isn't exactly clean anyway." "That's a great idea," Quentin agreed enthusiastically. Stanford looked up sharply and then checked his appointment book. "I have some time this afternoon, so how about you bring him in here, Sergeant? Get a subpoena if you have to. Just make sure he shows up. And make it happen soon after lunch," he said, tapping the desk with irritation. "If I do nothing else, I'm determined to get rid of some of this human debris that's cluttering up the case, and Jensen is as good a starting point as any. I'll either turn these various suspicious circumstances into something useful, or I'll root them out entirely. Then we'll see where we stand." Oscar shook his head with a sense of hopelessness and left. "Poor unfortunate man," Quentin sighed as he watched Oscar go. "He is completely overwhelmed by despair." "And you'd feel the same," snapped Stanford, "if the newspapers were tearing you apart for a political spectacle. By the way, weren't you supposed to bring some good news this afternoon, or something like that?" "I suppose I did hint at some hope." Quentin sat lost in thought, gazing out the window for several minutes. "Stanford, this Julian draws me in like a magnet. He annoys and unsettles me. He invades my dreams. He's the haunting presence on my mind. He torments me like a ghost." "Does this lament qualify as good news?" "I won't find peace," Quentin continued, "until I know where Lowy the furrier was between 11 o'clock and midnight on Monday. He was definitely somewhere he shouldn't have been. And you, Stanford, need to find out. Please make Julian the next focus of your investigation into this mess. He'll talk if you push him right. Be tough, old friend. Let him think you suspect him of the murder. Ask him about the fur model. What's her name? Frisbee." He suddenly paused, frowning deeply. "Wait a moment, I wonder. Yes, Stanford, you must ask him about the fur model. Find out when he last saw her, and try to look clever and mysterious while you do it." "Listen, Quentin," Stanford was frustrated. "You've been obsessively chasing after Julian for 3 days. What has you so fixated on him?" "Intuition, pure intuition. My intuitive nature, you see." "I'd buy that if I hadn't known you for 15 years. Stanford studied him carefully, then shrugged. "I'll have a word with Julian once I'm done dealing with Jensen." Chapter 19. The Doctor Explains. Friday, June 14, 2 p.m. We had lunch in the district attorney's private office, and at 2 o'clock, Dr. Jensen arrived. Oscar was with him, and the look on the sergeant's face clearly showed he was none too pleased with the company. The doctor, responding to Stanford's invitation, took a seat facing the district attorney's desk. "What's the meaning of this latest outrage?" he asked, with a chill in his voice. "Do you think it's your right to force a citizen to set aside his private matters just to be bullied?" "It's my responsibility to bring murderers to justice," Stanford replied, equally cold. "If a citizen believes that assisting the authorities is an outrage, then that's his right. If you're concerned about answering my questions, Doctor, you have the right to have your attorney present. Would you like to call him to come here now for your legal defense?" Dr. Jensen paused for a moment. "I don't require legal protection, sir. Would you kindly inform me why I was summoned here?" "Of course. You're here to clarify several points that have come to light regarding your relationship with Miss Simon, and to explain, if you wish, why you chose to mislead me during our last meeting about that relationship. So, I take it you've been unreasonably prying into my private matters. I had heard that such practices were once common in Russia. If you believe the scrutiny was unwarranted, Dr. Jensen, I can easily be persuaded to forget everything I've learned about you. But let's be honest. Your feelings for Miss Simon went beyond mere paternal affection, didn't they? Are even a man's sacred feelings not respected by the police in this country?" The doctor spoke with a bitter disdain. "Under certain conditions, yes. Under others, no." Stanford managed to keep his anger in check. "You're not obligated to answer. However, if you choose to be transparent, you might avoid the embarrassment of being questioned publicly by the people's attorney in court." Dr. Jensen flinched, and contemplated his response for a long moment. And if I concede that my feelings for Miss Simon were more than paternal, what then? Stanford took his response as a confirmation. You were, in fact, deeply jealous of her, weren't you, Doctor? Jealousy, Dr. Jensen replied, adopting an ironically professional tone, is not an unusual byproduct of infatuation. Scholars like Krafft-Ebing, Mahl, Freud, Ferenczi, and Adler regard it as a common psychological consequence of romantic attraction. Very enlightening, Stanford nodded, showing appreciation. So I take it you were infatuated with, let's say, romantically drawn to Miss Simon, and at times you displayed that psychological consequence of jealousy. You can assume whatever you wish, but I don't see why my feelings should concern you. If your feelings hadn't led you to questionable and alarming actions, I wouldn't be interested at all. But I have credible information that your emotions clouded your judgment to the extent that you threatened both Miss Simon's life and your own. And considering that the young woman has since been murdered, it's only natural and reasonable for the law to be curious. The doctor's typically pale face took on a sickly hue, and his long fingers gripped the arms of his chair tightly. Yet he remained still and dignified, his gaze locked intently on the district attorney. I hope, added Stanford, you won't raise my suspicions further with any attempts to deny what's been said. Quentin observed the man closely, then leaned forward. Tell me, Doctor, what method of harm did you threaten Miss Simon with? Dr. Jensen turned sharply, his head snapping toward Quentin. He inhaled sharply, and his whole body tensed. Blood rushed to his cheeks, and there was a noticeable twitching around his mouth and throat. For a brief moment, I feared he might lose control, but after a moment's struggle, he regained his composure. You think I meant to strangle her? His words were charged with intense anger. And you'd like to twist my threat into a noose to hang me? Nonsense. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had calmed. I did once foolishly try to frighten Miss Simon with a threat to kill her and then take my own life. But if your information is as accurate as you claim, you must know that my threat involved a revolver. That's the weapon, I believe, that's typically mentioned in empty threats. I certainly wouldn't have considered threatening her with something as horrid as Thuggee, even if I had the capacity for such a vile act. True, Quentin nodded. That's a fair point, I must say. The doctor seemed to find encouragement in Quentin's demeanor. He faced Stanford again and expanded on his confession. A threat, as I'm sure you realize, is rarely the harbinger of violent action. A little exploration into the human psyche would reveal that a threat is, in fact, prima facie evidence of one's innocence. A threat, in general, tends to arise from anger, serving as a release for those feelings. He averted his gaze. I'm not a married man, and my emotional state has been rather unstable. I find myself dealing with overly sensitive and fraught individuals often. During a time of heightened vulnerability, I developed an infatuation for a young woman, an infatuation that she clearly didn't share, at least not with the same intensity I felt. I experienced considerable pain, and she made no effort to ease my suffering. In fact, I suspected more than once that she was cruelly toying with me by associating with other men. Sure enough, she didn't try to hide her betrayals from me. I'll admit that there were moments I was nearly driven to distraction. In my desperation to provoke a more caring response from her, I issued her a threat. I trust you can read human nature well enough to take my word for it. Setting that aside for now, Stanford replied, maintaining a neutral tone. Could you provide me with more detailed information about your whereabouts on Monday night? I noticed a faint yellow hue wash over the man's face, and his body tensed slightly. Yet, when he spoke again, his usual charm returned. I thought my note to you addressed that question adequately. Have I missed something? What was the name of the patient during your visit that night? Mrs. Anna Bredon. She is the widow of the late Amos H. Bredon, who was associated with the Bredon National Bank in Long Branch. And you stated you were with her from 11 until 1. Is that correct? That is correct. Was Mrs. Bredon, the only person who could confirm your presence at the sanitarium during those hours. I'm afraid so. You see, once it's past 10 at night, I never ring the bell. I simply use my own key to enter. May I ask Mrs. Bredon about it? Dr. Jensen looked genuinely regretful. Mrs. Bredon is a very ill woman. She experienced a profound shock when her husband passed away last summer, and since then she has been almost in a daze. There are moments when I genuinely worry for her mental state. The least bit of disruption or excitement could have severe consequences. He pulled a newspaper clipping from a gold-edged case and handed it to Stanford. You'll notice that this obituary mentions her breakdown and her stay in a private sanitarium. I've been her doctor for many years. Stanford glanced at the clipping and returned it. A brief silence settled before Quentin asked, "By the way, Doctor, what's the name of the night nurse at your sanitarium?" Dr. Jensen looked up suddenly. "My night nurse? What does she have to do with this? She was quite busy Monday night. I don't understand. If you need her name, though, it's Finkel, Miss Amelia Finkel." Quentin jotted down the name and stood up, taking the slip of paper to ask her. "Sergeant, have Miss Finkel come here tomorrow morning at 11, he said, giving a slight wink. "I'll get right on it, sir. Good idea." His tone suggested trouble was brewing for Miss Finkel. A look of worry crossed Dr. Jensen's face. "Forgive me for saying, but I find your questioning methods rather unrefined." His voice dripped with disdain. "May I hope that your interrogation is concluded for now?" "I believe that will be all, Doctor," Stanford replied politely. "Shall I call a taxi for you?" "Your thoughtfulness is overwhelming, but my car is waiting downstairs." With that, Dr. Jensen exited with an air of indignation. Stanford promptly summoned Donovan and sent him to fetch Tracy. The detective arrived shortly, polishing his pince-nez and bowing with a friendly demeanor. He could easily be mistaken for an actor rather than a detective, yet his skill in handling sensitive situations was well known in the department. "I need you to bring Mr. Louis Julian again," Stanford said. "Bring him here immediately. I'm eager to see him." Tracy smiled politely, adjusted his glasses, and set off on his task. "And now," Stanford continued, directing a reproachful look at Quentin, "I want to know what you were thinking when you tipped Jensen off about the night nurse. Your mind seems to be elsewhere this afternoon. Do you really believe I hadn't considered the nurse? Now you've given him a heads-up. He has until 11 tomorrow morning to coach her on her statements. Honestly, Quentin, I can't think of a better way to undermine our efforts to confirm the man's alibi." "I did manage to get under his skin a bit, did I?" Quentin grinned with satisfaction. "Whenever your opponent starts ranting about how insane your ideas are, you know he's already feeling the heat. But Stanford, don't lose your temper over my lapse. If you and I both thought of the nurse, do you really think that clever doctor didn't also? If this Miss Finkel were the type to be bribed, he would have secured her false testimony days ago, and she'd have been named alongside the unconscious Mrs. Bredon as a witness to his whereabouts at the sanitarium Monday night. The fact that he didn't mention her tells us she won't be persuaded to lie. No, Stanford, I intentionally put him on alert. Now he'll have to act before we question Miss Finkel, and I'm confident I know what he'll do." "Let me get this straight," Oscar interjected. "Am I supposed to track down the Finkel woman tomorrow morning or not?" "There won't be any need," Quentin replied. "I fear we are fated not to meet this Florence Nightingale. A rendezvous with us is likely the last thing the doctor wants." "True enough," Stanford conceded. "But don't forget that he may have been up to something entirely unrelated to the murder on Monday night, that he simply doesn't want to come to light." Almost everyone who knew the Cardinal chose Monday night to indulge in their secret vices. Quite suspicious, wouldn't you say? Porter insists he was engrossed in Kun. Brady claims he was exploring the countryside around Jersey's Lake District. Jensen wants us to imagine he was soothing the troubled. And I have it on good authority that Julian has gone to great lengths to craft an alibi in case we start asking questions. In fact, they all seem to have been up to something they'd rather we not find out. But what was it? And why did they all, in unison, pick the night of the murder for their clandestine activities? Activities they won't even mention, even to clear their names. Was there a horde of Efreets running amok in the city that evening? Was the world under some kind of curse, compelling men to engage in sordid acts? Was dark magic afoot? I don't think so. I'm betting on Porter, Oscar declared stubbornly. I recognize a professional job when I see one. You can't ignore those fingerprints and the professor's findings on the chisel. Stanford looked deeply puzzled. I knew his belief in Porter's guilt had been shaken somewhat by Quentin's theory that the crime was a carefully planned act by a cunning, educated individual. Now, however, he seemed to falter back towards Oscar's perspective. I'll admit, he said, that Jensen, Brady, and Julian don't inspire much faith in their innocence. But since they're all under the same cloud of suspicion, it somewhat dilutes the force of doubt against them. After all, Porter is the only one who logically fits the role of strangler. He has the visible motive, and he's the only one with actual evidence against him. Quentin sighed, weariness evident in his voice. Yes, yes, fingerprints and chisel marks. You're such a trusting soul, Stanford. Since Porter's fingerprints were found in the apartment, it must mean he strangled the woman. So simple, isn't it? Why look any further? A closed case. Send Porter to the gallows and let that be the end of it. Is it effective? Sure, but is it really art? In your eagerness to critique, you're understating our case against Porter, Stanford said, a touch irritated. I'll admit your arguments against him are clever, so clever, in fact, I hate to dismiss them. But popular truth often leans on mere cleverness, which is why it can be so misguided. Your theory would likely resonate with the masses, but Stanford, it simply isn't true. Oscar, the practical one, remained unmoved. He sat there, frowning at the table, seemingly oblivious to the back and forth between Stanford and Quentin. You know, Mr. Stanford, he said, as if revealing an unformed idea, if we could figure out how Porter came and went from Simon's apartment, we'd strengthen our case against him. I can't quite piece it together. It's got me stumped. I've been thinking we should hire an architect to examine those rooms. The house is old. Who knows when it was built? And there might be some way in that we haven't realized yet. Good heavens! Quentin stared at him with a mix of amusement and disbelief. You're getting downright poetic. Secret passageways, hidden doors, staircases concealed within the walls. Is that the angle you're pursuing? Oh, my word. Sergeant, beware of the movies. They've led many a man astray. Consider grand opera instead. It's more tedious but less corrupting. That's fair enough, Mr. Quentin. Oscar didn't seem overly enthusiastic about his own architectural idea. But without knowing how Porter got in, it makes sense to eliminate a few ways he definitely didn't. I'm with you on that, Sergeant, Stanford replied. I'll get an architect on it right away. He called for Donovan and gave the necessary instructions. Quentin stretched his legs and let out a yawn. Now all we need is a favorite of the harem, some attendants with palm leaf fans, and a bit of pizzicato music. You sure love to joke, mister. Quentin, Oscar lit a new cigar. But even if the architect finds nothing wrong with the apartment, Porter's likely to slip up any time now. I'm putting my naive faith in Julian, Quentin replied. I can't explain why. He's not a decent person, and he's hiding something. Stanford, you must not let him leave until he tells you where he was on Monday night. And don't forget to drop a mysterious hint about the fur model. Chapter 20. Midnight Witness. Friday, June 14, 3:30 p.m. In less than half an hour, Julian arrived. Oscar stood up to offer his seat to the newcomer, then settled into a large chair beneath the windows. Quentin was positioned at the small table to Stanford's right, giving him a clear view of Julian from the side. It was obvious that Julian was not looking forward to this meeting. His small eyes darted around the office, momentarily narrowing suspiciously at Oscar, before finally resting on the district attorney. He seemed even more alert than during his previous visit, and while his greeting to Stanford was overly polite, it carried an undercurrent of nervousness. Stanford's demeanor certainly did not help. He appeared as a formidable, unyielding prosecutor as he gestured for Julian to sit down. Julian placed his hat and cane on the table and perched on the edge of his chair, his back rigid and straight as a flagpole. "I'm still not satisfied with what you told me on Wednesday, Mr. Julian," Stanford began. "I hope you won't force me to take serious measures to discover what you know about Miss Simon's death." "What I know," Julian attempted a smile meant to soothe. "Mr. Stanford, Mr. Stanford." He seemed more slippery than usual as he gestured helplessly with his hands. "If I knew anything, I promise, I would tell you. Absolutely I would." "I'm glad to hear that. Your willingness makes this easier. So let's start with this. Where were you at midnight on Monday?" Julian's eyes slowly narrowed until they sparkled like tiny coins, but he remained otherwise still. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You want to know where I was Monday? Why should I have to say? Am I being suspected of the murder? Yes. You're not a suspect at this moment. However, your reluctance to answer my question raises suspicion. Why don't you want me to know your whereabouts?" "I have no reason to keep it from you, you understand." Julian shrugged nonchalantly. "I've got nothing to be ashamed of, absolutely. I had several accounts to review at the office, winter season stocks. I was there until 10 o'clock, maybe even later, then at 10:30. "That's enough," Quentin interrupted sharply. "There's no need to drag anyone else into this." His tone carried a certain weight, and Julian studied him closely, trying to gauge what understanding, if any, lay behind his words. But Quentin's expression revealed nothing. Still, the warning was enough to make Julian pause. "You really don't want to know where I was at 10:30? "Not really," Quentin replied. "What we're interested in is where you were at midnight. There's no need to mention anyone who might have seen you then. When you tell us the truth, we'll know it." He took on the same mysterious air he had previously assigned to Stanford. Without breaking his promise to Alice La Farce, he had planted seeds of doubt in Julian's mind. Before Julian could formulate a response, Quentin stood up and leaned meaningfully over the district attorney's desk. "You know a Miss Frisbee. She lives on 71st Street, specifically, at number 184, to be precise, in the same building where Miss Simon lived, to put it simply, in apartment number 2. Miss Frisbee was once a model for you, a sociable girl, still willing to entertain the advances of her former employer, meaning you. When did you last see her, Mr. Julian? Take your time answering. You might want to think about it." Julian did take his time. A full minute passed before he spoke, and then he posed another question. "Do I not have the right to visit a lady, don't I?" "Of course. So why would a question about such an obviously innocent and respectable encounter make you uneasy?" "Me uneasy?" Julian forced a smile with great effort. "I'm just curious about what's on your mind, asking me about my private life. I'll tell you. Miss Simon was murdered around midnight on Monday. No one entered or exited through the front door of the building, and the side door was locked. The only way anyone could have accessed her apartment was through apartment 2, and nobody who knew Miss Simon ever visited apartment 2, except for you." At this, Julian leaned over the table, gripping its edge tightly. His eyes widened, and his full lips parted in shock. But it wasn't fear that showed in his demeanor, it was pure disbelief. He sat for a moment, staring at Quentin, dazed and skeptical. "Is that what you believe? That no one could get in or out except through apartment 2 because the side door was locked? What if that side door wasn't locked on Monday night? Where would that leave me? Where would I be?" "I'd say you'd be right here, with the district attorney." Quentin maintained his steady gaze, observing him closely. "Of course I would," Julian snapped back. "Let me tell you something, my friend. That's exactly where I stand, firmly." He abruptly turned to Stanford. "I'm a decent guy, you know, but I've kept quiet long enough. That side door was not locked on Monday night, and I know who slipped out of it at 5 minutes to 12. "All right, then," Quentin remarked, sitting back down and lighting a cigarette with an air of calm. Stanford was too stunned to respond immediately, and Oscar sat frozen, his cigar halfway to his mouth. Eventually, Stanford leaned back, crossing his arms. "I think it's time you share the whole story, Mr. Julian." His tone was firm, making the request clear. Julian adjusted his position in his chair. "Oh, I'm going to tell it. Believe me, I will. You're spot on. I was with Miss Frisbee that evening. Nothing wrong with that." "And what time did you arrive there?" "After work, around 5:30 or 5:45. I took the subway, got off at 72nd and walked over." "And you entered the house, through the front door?" "No, I walked down the alleyway and used the side door, like I usually do. It's nobody's concern who I visit, and what the telephone operator in the hall doesn't know won't hurt him." "That makes sense so far," Oscar remarked. "The janitor didn't lock the side door until after 6. "And did you stay the whole evening, Mr. Julian?" Stanford asked. "Definitely, until just before midnight. Miss Frisbee made dinner and I brought a bottle of wine. It was a small gathering, just the two of us. I didn't step outside the apartment, you understand, until 5 minutes to 12. You can bring the lady down here and ask her. I'll call her now and have her clarify exactly what happened that night. I'm not asking you to just take my word for it, not at all." Stanford waved off the suggestion. "What happened at 5 minutes to 12? Julian hesitated, clearly reluctant to get to the point. "I'm a decent guy, you understand, and a friend is a friend. But I ask you, is that any reason for me to get into trouble over something I had nothing to do with?" He paused for a response, but when none came, he continued. "Sure, I'm right about that. Anyway, hear what happened. As I said, I was visiting the lady. I had another appointment scheduled for later that night, so a few minutes before midnight, I said my goodbyes and got ready to leave. Just as I opened the door, I saw someone sneaking away from the Cardinal's apartment down the little back hall toward the side door. There was light in the hall, and the door to apartment 2 faces that side door. I saw the guy as clearly as I see you, definitely as clear." "Who was it?" "Well, if you really need to know, it was Pop Brady." Stanford's head snapped up slightly. "What did you do then?" "Nothing, Mr. Stanford, absolutely nothing. I didn't think much about it, you understand. I knew Pop was after the Cardinal, and I just figured he'd been visiting her. But I didn't want Pop to see me, none of his business where I choose to spend my time. I waited quietly until he went out." "Through the side door?" "Exactly. Then I followed him out that way. I initially planned to leave through the front door since I knew the side door was locked at night. But when I saw Pop head out that way, I figured I might as well do the same. No point in giving away my business to a telephone operator if I didn't have to, no point at all. So I left the same way I came in, caught a taxi on Broadway, and went." "That's enough," Quentin's authoritative tone interrupted him again. "Fine, fine." Julian seemed satisfied to stop there. "But you have to understand, I don't want you to think." "We don't." Stanford was confused by these interruptions, but chose not to say anything. "When you heard about Miss Simon's death, why didn't you bring this important information to the police?" "Why would I want to get involved?" Julian replied, surprised. "I have plenty of my own troubles. I don't need to add to them." "A convenient choice," Stanford said, clearly frustrated. "Yet you did imply to me, after you learned about the murder, that Brady was being blackmailed by Miss Simon." "Of course I did. Doesn't that show I was trying to help you, giving you a valuable tip?" "Did you see anyone else that night in the hall or alley?" "Nobody. Absolutely no one." "Did you hear anyone in the Simon apartment? Anyone talking or moving around, perhaps?" "Didn't hear a thing." Julian shook his head firmly. "And you're sure of the time you saw Brady leave? 5 minutes to 12. "Definitely. I looked at my watch and said to the lady, I'm leaving the same day I came. It won't be tomorrow for 5 minutes yet." Stanford went over his story point by point, trying various ways to get him to admit more than he had already shared. But Julian neither expanded on his account nor changed any details. After half an hour of questioning, he was allowed to leave. Well, at least we've uncovered one piece of the puzzle, Quentin remarked. I'm not sure how it fits into the bigger picture just yet, but it's definitely helpful and raises some interesting points. And I must say, how wonderfully my instincts about Julian have proven true. Of course, your precious instincts, Stanford replied, looking at him with skepticism. But why did you cut him off when he was trying to tell me something? Oh, you'll never know, Quentin recited playfully. I just can't share that with you, old friend. My deepest apologies, truly. His tone was light-hearted, yet Stanford understood that in moments like this, Quentin was deeply serious, so he didn't press the issue. I couldn't help but wonder if Miss Lafarce appreciated just how fortunate she was to place her trust in Quentin's honesty. Oscar had been noticeably unsettled by Julian's account. I don't understand how that side door could have been unlocked, he grumbled. How on earth did it get bolted from the inside after Julian left, and who unbolted it after 6 o'clock? In due time, my sergeant, the truth will come to light, Quentin replied. Maybe it will, and maybe it won't. But if we do figure it out, mark my words, the answer will lead us to Porter. He's the one we need to pin down. Brady isn't any kind of expert at breaking in, and neither is Julian. Still, there was a skilled technician at work that night, and it wasn't your friend the dude, though he probably crafted the opening of the jewelry case. You mean there were 2 of them? Is that your theory, Mr. Quentin? You mentioned that before, and I'm not dismissing it. But if we can tie any of this to Porter, we'll make sure he reveals who his accomplice was. He wasn't an accomplice, Sergeant. It was probably someone. We don't know. Stanford glared into the distance, lost in thought. I really don't trust the Brady side of this situation, he said. There's been something off about him ever since Monday. And I must say, Quentin chimed in, doesn't that gentleman's fabricated alibi seem a bit suspicious now? You understand, I hope, why I held you back from questioning him about it at the club yesterday. I thought if you could get Julian to open up, you'd be in a better position to extract some truths from Brady. And look, once again, intuition triumphs. With what you now know about him, you can press him quite effectively, right? And that's exactly what I intend to do. Stanford called for Donovan. Get Charles Brady on the line, he snapped. Call him at the Beaumont Club and at his home. He lives just around the corner on West 27th Street. Let him know I want him here in half an hour, or I'll send a couple of detectives to bring him in cuffs. For 5 minutes, Stanford stood by the window, smoking nervously, while Quentin amused himself with the Wall Street Journal. Oscar poured himself a glass of water and paced the room. Soon, Donovan returned. Sorry, Chief, but it's a no-go. Brady's gone out to the country somewhere. He won't be back until late tonight. Damn it, fine, that's enough. Stanford turned to Oscar. You'll have Brady brought in tonight, Sergeant, and I want him here tomorrow morning at 9. He'll be here, sir. Oscar stopped pacing and met Stanford's gaze. I've been mulling something over, sir, and there's one thing that keeps nagging at me. Do you remember that black document box that was sitting on the living room table? It was empty, and generally, a woman keeps letters and such in a box like that. Well, here's what's been troubling me. That box wasn't forced open. It was unlocked with a key. A professional criminal wouldn't bother with letters and documents, don't you think, sir? Sergeant, Quentin exclaimed, gratitude spilling from his words. I bow before you. I'm at your feet. The document box, the one that was neatly opened and empty. Of course. Porter didn't open it, not in this lifetime. That was the work of the other fellow. What were you thinking about that box, Sergeant? Stanford inquired. Just this, sir. As Mr. Quentin has pointed out from the start, there might have been someone other than Porter in that apartment last night. And you mentioned that Brady confessed to you he paid Simon a large sum last June to recover his letters. But what if he never actually paid? What if he went there on Monday night and took those letters himself? Wouldn't that explain why he told you he had bought them back? Maybe that's how Julian ended up seeing him there. That's a reasonable thought, Stanford conceded. But where does that lead us? Well, if Brady did take them on Monday night, he might still have them. And if any of those letters are dated after last June, when he claimed to have repurchased them, then we'd have him dead to rights. And, as I said, sir, I've been pondering this. Brady is out of town today, and if we could get our hands on those letters— Of course it could be useful, Stanford replied calmly, locking eyes with the sergeant. But that's simply not feasible. Even so, Oscar muttered. Brady has been pulling a lot of questionable moves on you, sir.